13. Tendahai explains. Tendahai fell asleep as soon as she put her head in Sibonjile's lap. In no time she was purring softly like an overfed kitten in a butchery. Both Sibonjile and Julia were deep in thought, wondering why their family had always been adept at getting hold of the wrong end of the stick. Maybe we're a cursed family, thought Sibonjile, imagining an old woman in tattered clothes, a dead snake dangling from her toothless mouth, pronouncing the curse on their ancestors, "May luck elude your family from now on." Julia thought everything was God's wish, but that for one reason or another, the Lord wasn't fair to them. Why had she become pregnant so early in life? And why had Sibonjile's marriage ended up in a divorce? It was close to dawn when they reached Blantyre after being stopped a couple of times by the police after leaving Molosa. Julia couldn't help wondering why the police were so particular in checking cars that night. Couldn't be just a routine check. No way. Something must have happened. As the car flashed past the Kanjedza location, Sibonjile sat up and looked at her sister questioningly. "Going to my house," Julia declared. Her voice sounded like that of someone who had had a terrible nightmare and still hadn't recovered from it. "But," began Sibonjile, thinking of her pile of work at the office. "Can't be alone," said Julia curtly. "Okay. If you wish." "I do." "Okay. To your house then." Minutes later, the Datsun arrived at the gate of Dr. Moyo's residence. Julia pressed the horn button until Alone came rushing from the boys' quarters to unlock the gate. Once in the house, Julia prepared coffee for 3, but she didn't drink hers, for she said she wanted to talk to Dan. Whether it meant dragging him out of bed or not, she had to talk to him. In the bedroom, she dialed Club Matola and asked for Dr. Dan Moyo's extension. The operator said hold on, and after a while he was back to her and said he was positive the receiver hadn't been placed back onto its cradle. "You want somebody to wake him up?" "No, thanks. I'll try later." When she replaced the receiver, she was not a happy woman, for there was already a nagging thought on her mind: maybe he had deliberately taken the phone off its cradle because he didn't want to receive her calls. If that was the case, it meant that he must have somehow got wind of the family secret. But the question was, how had he got wind of it? Could it have been through Alphonse? Could Alphonse have gone that far? Good God, I wish I knew what you hoped to gain by destroying my life, Alphonse. Are you just being plain selfish or plain stupid? She shuddered as she recalled the last time they had met. Monday, wasn't it, when she had run into him at the open market? That is when he had snarled, "Let's say if you don't give me 1,000 kwacha by Wednesday, I'll have an appointment with your husband," and you know what I'll say. Anyway, all I'm saying is that he doesn't know about your relationship with me. That is what he had said. Pure blackmail. She cursed herself for having been dim-witted enough at one time in her life to get involved with such a devil in human shape. Does it mean, she wondered, that Alphonse has already carried out his threat? "I'll have an appointment with your husband." Has he rung Dan and spilled the beans? But she dismissed this line of thought because she was sure Alphonse wouldn't know that Dan had gone to Club Matola. But there it was again. The same thought. It wasn't a secret that Dan was away to Club Matola, was it? So, who would stop the hospital personnel from telling people where Dr. Moyo was if he was wanted on the phone? "But you may be right, Julia," she said to herself. "Alphonse couldn't have contacted Dan because he had given you up to Wednesday to consider his proposition, and you can't expect him to be sophisticated enough to consider Wednesday as starting at a minute after midnight. For people like Alphonse, the day starts when the sun rises." Well, suppose Alphonse had for some reason carried out his threat. Good God, she choked back a startled cry as she realized that Tendahai hadn't even explained fully how she had gone to Molosa and why. Could Alphonse? Julia walked quickly out of the bedroom and found both Tendahai and Sibonjile dozing in their seats. Asleep, Tendahai had an air of tragic innocence of a condemned sheep on slaughter day. Throwing herself on the seat opposite Tendahai, Julia asked quickly as if out of breath, "Tendahai, you..." She couldn't get the right words out. "Sis." Tendahai tried to sit up, her eyes tired. "Tell us how you got to Molosa," Julia said. Sibonjile, who had been too tired to remember that they hadn't yet got the full story from Tendahai, sat up as if someone had driven a sharp needle into the back of the chair. Yes, how did you find your way there? Sibongile asked. Tendahai grimaced. Probably she didn't want to be reminded of whatever she had been through, thought Sibongile, all sorts of wild scenes crisscrossing the screen of her mind. Poor girl. Then Tendahai started telling them her story. She said the good gentleman with the ugly face who had been kind enough to give her 5 kwacha the other day had come to the school just as they were leaving and had offered her a lift in a taxi. To Sis Julia's place, came the answer from Tendahai, and she went on to say that the man had told her he was no stranger and that he was related to the family. You see, it's Alphonse all right, sighed Julia, closing her eyes painfully. What else had he said? Did he explain the relationship? Sibongile asked slowly. No. Go on, what happened, Tendahai, breathed Julia, the suspense threatening to shatter her nerves. What happened? Her eyes on Sis Julia, Tendahai said that for some reason, she hadn't been afraid of the man. His face was ugly, but she was sure his heart wasn't. Honestly, I didn't fear him, Sis. But when he had said they should go to his house first, she had thought it wasn't proper and that maybe she had been too trusting. Never trust strangers, muttered Sibongile with the feeling of a hurt parent. Maybe she had failed to bring up the girl properly, she thought. This one was a friendly stranger, Sis Sibo, said Tendahai, hoping her sisters weren't going to call in the police. She didn't want that ugly good man to be in trouble. No. What happened? Asked Julia again. What happened was that the moment the taxi started taking a different route, Tendahai had one thing on her mind: she had to get away. An opportunity had presented itself when the driver had pulled up outside some flats to buy himself cigarettes. Seizing this golden opportunity, she had dashed off at an I don't care what I run into speed. Tendahai concluded the story of her adventure by telling her sisters about how she had got onto the wrong bus and how she had found herself at Molosa. It's kidnap, thundered Julia. He wanted to blackmail me. My. Take it easy, Julia, said her elder sister, her voice hard, making Tendahai wonder why Sis Sibo was getting harsh with Sis Julia. It's kidnap. Easy, rasped Sibongile, although she couldn't help imagining Tendahai sprawled in a corner of some dirty house, her hands and feet tied together and a soiled handkerchief stuffed into her mouth. I know what he was after. Money. Told me he. Shut up, Julia. Remember, Tendahai has had a tough time. Julia looked at the ceiling unblinkingly as if to remove herself away from the world. Then slowly she got to her feet, patted Tendahai on the head and staggered to her bedroom, locking herself in. She knew what she was going to do. A letter had to be written to Dan. No matter what. I am sorry, Dan, that I have been a cheat for so long. 4 years I've lived with a lie known as the family secret. By family I mean Ma and I. Of course, Papa had known of the family secret, but I'm sure he had never liked it. Neither had my aunt and her husband. Sibongile. She's my elder sister. Whether she had liked it or not, she had to accept the secret. There had been no choice for her. An 18-year-old lad called Alphonse, his body bulging with thick muscle, had sweet-talked me into playing adult games with him. You know what I mean, Dan, don't you? The result of our silly little game was that I became pregnant. And, Dan, you can imagine how my mom felt like. She almost ran berserk. How was she going to face the neighbors? The scandal. The gossips. The behind-your-back sniggers. Maybe I should have run away from home, but there had been nowhere to go, for Alphonse had been whisked off to prison. You see, my ma had quite a high reputation among the neighbors in Mufukos. She was an educated woman who could allow her children to eat at the table only if they had had their bath. Not only that, but Ma had been highly placed in her church. So, if the people had known that her 13-year-old daughter had been allowed to get into trouble, they would have developed a low opinion indeed of their church elder. Thus, Ma did what she thought was the only way out. Whether she did it for my sake or hers, I don't know. She and I left Mufukos for Mangura after spreading the word that I was leaving for our home, Malawi, to attend boarding school, and she was going to Mangura to look after her ailing sister. Dan, I'm not trying to defend myself, but I'm explaining to you what happened. If you want to take me back, it's up to you. I'm not defending myself, for how can the guilty have any defense? An explanation yes, a defense no. I love you, Dan. In case you are wondering, Alphonse and I grew up together. Both of us were born in Zimbabwe and both of us were born of Malawian parents. He was older than me and he was such a football wizard that he soon became a household name. On the pitch, Alphonse was Prince. He could have the ball in his possession for a good 5 minutes, dribbling his way past the defenders before kicking it into the net. And the crowd would roar, Alphonse. He treated me like a kid though until I told him I wasn't a toddler. Maybe I wanted to prove that I wasn't young, and in doing that I made a terrible blunder. I never loved Alphonse. Never. How could I, for the heart loves once? And the only man I love is you, Dan. I'm not asking you to forgive me, I'm just trying to explain why there has been a sudden change in my behavior since the last time we went for that movie. You remember? That is the day I met Alphonse for the first time in God knows how many years. It was as if I was seeing a ghost. He recognized me in a flash, as I did him. With the recognition came the memories from my past. And since that night when I saw him, I knew sooner or later the family secret would soon be no more. When I saw Alphonse that night in a doorman's uniform, I was somehow reminded of the day he and I had sneaked from home to watch a movie in the town hall. The preacher in the movie had begun his sermon with a quotation from the Bible. And as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? I think what made me remember these words from the Holy Book was the word, sin. You see, Dan, the family secret is actually a sin. I am sorry, Dan, perhaps it's my fault for believing that one can bury the past once and for all. Maybe it's my fault for not realizing that one can't fool the world forever. Dan, I was telling you about Ma Annie leaving Mufukos, wasn't I? Fine. We went to stay with her sister and not a soul in Mufukos knew Ma, and I was still on Zimbabwe soil. I gave birth to a beautiful little one, and a few weeks later, I left Mangura for Malawi. With the help of Ma's distant cousin, I secured a place at a boarding school and continued with my education as if nothing had happened. Ma, who had been writing to her friends that she was expectant, finally left Mangura to go back to Mufukos. She went back, a child in her lap which she claimed was hers. Later my parents moved to another house farther away. After disappointing my parents like that, I decided to turn over a new leaf. I worked hard at school. When the exams came, I scored a high grade and made it to Providence Secondary School. I worked harder still until I sat for the school certificate exams. My performance, like that of most of the Zimbabwean educated girls, was above average, and so I was offered a place at Chancellor College, University of Malawi. And then I met you, Dan. I couldn't tell you about the family secret for, as I said earlier, the family secret was a sin. I couldn't tell you that my mother had tried hard to keep it from becoming public knowledge. I couldn't tell you, Dan, that the family secret was actually a living secret. It was a living one because Tendahai is the family secret. How could I tell you that the girl who called me sis was really my own daughter? How could I tell you that I had been 13 when I gave birth to Tendahai? How could I tell you when she herself doesn't know that the person she calls Sis Julia is her own mother? How could I? I love you, Dan.